February 14th, 1984. Valentine's Day. While most of America was buying flowers and chocolates, 3 professional musicians walked into a rehearsal space in Wilton, Connecticut, expecting a standard audition. What they got instead was Ace Frehley standing in the middle of an empty room, surrounded by a fortress of Marshall amplifiers, stacked 3 high on each side, holding a bottle of Jack Daniels in one hand and a handwritten list of rules in the other. The first rule, scrawled in shaky capital letters on yellow legal pad paper, read, "No one tells me what to play." The second rule was even stranger. "If you see me drinking, you say nothing." And the third rule, the one that made bassist John Regan almost walk out before a single note was played, was the most disturbing of all. "We are not Kiss. We will never be Kiss. If you want Kiss, the door is behind you." This wasn't a band audition. This was a man trying to rebuild his identity from the ashes of the biggest failure of his life. And for the next 6 hours, in that freezing Connecticut warehouse with no heat and minimal lighting, with the February wind howling through cracks in the metal walls, Ace Frehley would push these 3 strangers to their absolute breaking point, creating something that would either save his career or destroy what was left of it. But to understand why Ace needed these rules, why he needed to control every aspect of this new venture with an iron fist wrapped in leather and desperation, you have to understand what the previous 18 months had done to him. Subscribe to the channel for untold stories from rock's golden age, the moments that shaped legends, the chaos behind the creation, the truth they never put in the liner notes. When Ace Frehley left Kiss in December 1982, he wasn't just leaving a band. He was leaving an identity that had defined him for nearly a decade. The Space Ace character, the silver makeup, the smoking guitar, the persona that had made him a millionaire and a guitar hero to millions of kids. All of it belonged to Kiss. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley made that very clear in the legal documents Ace signed on his way out. He could take his royalties from past albums, his guitar collection, and his personal demons. But Space Ace stayed with Kiss. They owned the makeup design, trademarked and registered. They owned the character, every element of it. They even owned the right to replace him, which they did within weeks, bringing in Vinnie Vincent to wear the silver face and pretend to be the guitar hero Ace had created. The year 1983 was a black hole in Ace's life, a void he would later describe in interviews as the year I disappeared. He spent most of it in his Connecticut mansion, a sprawling property he'd bought at the height of Kiss's fame with 8 bedrooms and a home studio, now feeling like a museum dedicated to someone else's success. The gold records on the walls mocked him every time he walked past. The guitars in their cases, the vintage Les Pauls and custom models, gathered dust because picking them up meant confronting what he'd lost. His marriage to Jeanette was disintegrating in slow motion. Fights about money and drinking and the future becoming so routine they barely registered as events anymore. Just background noise to the general collapse of everything he'd built. Ace would start drinking around noon, Jack Daniels straight from the bottle, and by evening he'd be in the basement studio, trying to write songs and producing nothing but noise and frustration. He'd record riffs and immediately erase them. He'd write lyrics and tear up the pages. Everything sounded either too much like Kiss or too much like a desperate attempt to not sound like Kiss. There was no middle ground, no authentic voice emerging from the wreckage, just the echoes of a character he could no longer play. His manager at the time, Larry Mazer, a sharp-dressed industry veteran who'd worked with everyone from Aerosmith to Ted Nugent, watched Ace's descent with growing alarm. Mazer knew talent when he saw it, and he knew Ace Frehley, despite everything, despite the drinking and the depression and the legal entanglements with Kiss, still had something valuable buried under all that wreckage. But getting Ace to see that, getting him to believe he could have a career outside the Kiss empire, required more than just words of encouragement. It required action. It required building something new from nothing. It required finding the right people who could handle Ace Frehley at his absolute worst and still believe in the possibility of something better. In December 1983, 3 musicians across the New York metropolitan area received nearly identical phone calls from Larry Mazer. John Reagan, a bassist who'd played with Peter Frampton and was known in session circles for his technical proficiency and unflappable personality, the kind of guy who could walk into any situation and adapt. Anton Fig, a drummer from South Africa who'd become a first-call session player in New York, working with everyone from Joe Cocker to Bob Dylan, with a reputation for both technical precision and creative flexibility. And Todd Howarth, a young multi-instrumentalist and vocalist from San Antonio who'd been bouncing around various hard rock projects, hungry for a break that would elevate him from sideman to something more significant. Mazer's pitch to each of them was deliberately vague, carefully calibrated to intrigue without revealing too much. "I've got a project with a major name. Can't tell you who yet, but it's real, it's funded, and if you're interested, show up at this address in February." He gave them the warehouse location, told them to bring their instruments, and hung up before they could ask too many questions. None of them knew they were being recruited for Ace Frehley's new band. Mazer had intentionally kept Ace's name out of the initial conversations because he knew exactly what would happen if word got out too early. The music press would descend like vultures. Kiss fans would start speculating and comparing before a single note was played. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley would catch wind of it and potentially create legal complications, claiming Ace was violating non-compete clauses or using Kiss-associated imagery. And most importantly, Ace himself might panic and sabotage the whole thing before it even started, which he'd done twice already with other potential band configurations in late 1983. But Mazer had another concern he didn't share with the musicians, a worry that kept him up at night in the weeks leading up to that Valentine's Day rehearsal. He wasn't entirely sure Ace would even show up. In the weeks prior, Ace had been increasingly erratic, missing phone calls, canceling preliminary planning meetings, and generally giving off the vibe of a man who was terrified of trying and failing publicly. Mazer had secured the rehearsal space, had the musicians lined up, had even arranged for a basic PA system and a 4-track tape recorder. Everything was in place. Everything except certainty that Ace Frehley would walk through that door sober enough and focused enough to make this work. The rehearsal space was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Wilton, Connecticut, the kind of industrial building that had probably manufactured car parts or appliances in the 1960s before being abandoned and then repurposed for artists and musicians who needed cheap, large spaces. It was February, the dead of winter in New England, and the heating system was barely functional, consisting of 2 ancient space heaters that did almost nothing against the cold air seeping through the metal walls. Everyone kept their jackets on, could see their breath when they talked. John Reagan arrived first, pulling up in his van around 9:30 in the morning, his bass rig in the back. He expected to find the other musicians, maybe get some coffee brewing, start setting up equipment. Instead, he found Ace Frehley sitting alone on a folding metal chair in the center of that vast, echoing space, surrounded by an absurd amount of guitar equipment. 4 full Marshall stacks, each one a half-stack head sitting on a 4x12 cabinet, creating a wall of amplification that was completely unnecessary for a rehearsal space. 3 Gibson Les Paul guitars on stands, their finishes catching the weak winter light coming through grimy windows. A collection of effects pedals that looked like they'd been thrown together randomly, wired with cables that snaked across the concrete floor. And that bottle of Jack Daniels, already half empty at 10 in the morning, sitting on a road case within easy reach. Ace looked up when Reagan walked in, and Reagan later described that first moment in multiple magazine interviews over the years as seeing someone who was simultaneously the most famous person I'd ever worked with and the most lost. Ace's eyes were bloodshot but focused, his hands steady despite the drinking, his posture somehow both defensive and determined. He stood up slowly, like a man carrying enormous weight, and shook Reagan's hand with surprising firmness. Then he said exactly 4 words. "You know who I am." It wasn't a question. It was a statement that carried all the weight of everything that had happened, everything Ace had lost, everything he was trying to become. Reagan nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet, and Ace handed him that piece of paper with the rules written on it. When Anton Fig and Todd Howarth arrived 15 minutes later, stamping snow off their boots and complaining about the cold, they found Reagan reading the rules with a bemused, slightly concerned expression, while Ace tuned one of his Les Pauls with obsessive precision, checking and rechecking each string like his life depended on perfect intonation, running through scales and listening for any slight imperfection. The warehouse had terrible acoustics, all concrete and metal creating harsh echoes, but Ace didn't seem to notice or care. He was locked into his own world, communicating with his guitar in a language the other musicians recognized, but couldn't quite penetrate. Mazer showed up last, deliberately giving the musicians time to process the situation without his interference. He walked in, saw the tension crackling in the cold air, saw Ace's white-knuckle grip on his guitar neck, saw the way the other 3 musicians were exchanging glances like people trying to decide if they should stay or run, and made an executive decision. "Okay," he announced to no one in particular, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "Let's plug in and see what happens. No talking, just play." What happened next would become legendary among the small circle of people who witnessed it, though the versions of the story would vary wildly depending on who was telling it and how many years had passed. Ace plugged his Les Paul, his favorite black custom model, into the Marshall stack on the left side of his amplifier wall, the one he'd modified himself with custom pickups and a wiring scheme he'd developed during the Kiss years. He adjusted the volume to a level that Anton Fig later described as approaching physical pain, somewhere past reasonable and well into the territory where you could feel the sound pressure in your chest. And then he hit a single chord, not a power chord, not a riff, not any of the signature licks people associated with Ace Frehley from Kiss, just one open E chord, sustained and vibrating and filling that warehouse with a sound that was somehow both exactly what you'd expect from Ace Frehley and completely different from anything he'd played in Kiss. The chord hung in the air, feedback beginning to build as Ace let it sustain, and the other musicians, professionals all with years of experience reading rooms and responding to musical cues, instinctively knew what to do. Anton locked into a simple 4/4 beat on his kit. Nothing fancy, no fills or flourishes, just establishing a foundation with kick drum and snare. John's bass found the root note and began outlining a progression, following his intuition about where the music wanted to go. Todd, who'd brought both a rhythm guitar setup and keyboards, chose the keyboard first, adding sustained chords that filled out the sonic space without competing with Ace's lead. And for the next 7 minutes, without a single word spoken, Without any predetermined arrangement or chord chart or plan, these four strangers created something that sounded remarkably complete. Ace's lead work wove through the structure the rhythm section had built, bluesy and melodic and occasionally exploding into those signature screaming bends that had defined his Kiss solos, but with something different underneath, something more personal and less theatrical. It wasn't a song yet. It was a conversation conducted entirely in musical language, each musician listening and responding and building on what the others were creating. When Ace finally let that last note ring out and fade into silence, when the feedback died away and the warehouse was quiet except for the ambient noise of wind and distant traffic, he turned around to face the other musicians with an expression that John Reagan would describe in interviews for decades afterward as the first time I saw him smile, and it was terrifying because you realized how desperately he needed this to work. But then Ace did something that completely shattered the moment of musical communion they'd just experienced. He unplugged his guitar, set it carefully on its stand, walked over to his leather jacket draped over a folding chair, pulled out that list of rules again, and announced in a voice that was trying to sound authoritative but came across as defensive that there were 7 more rules they hadn't discussed yet. And these rules, unlike the first 3 which had been about creative autonomy and personal boundaries, were about control, about Ace's need to manage every aspect of this project, because he'd spent the last year watching other people control his destiny, and he was never, ever going to let that happen again. Rule number 4. Ace read from his handwritten list, his voice echoing in that cavernous space. Every song goes through me first. I don't care who writes it. Todd Howarth, who fancied himself a songwriter and had brought several original compositions on cassette tape to potentially share with the group, felt his stomach sink. This wasn't going to be a collaborative democracy where everyone contributed equally. This was going to be Ace's vision, period, end of discussion. Rule number 5 was even more controlling, revealing Ace's paranoia about media narratives. No talking to the press without my approval. No interviews, no quotes, nothing. Ace had been burned by decades of interviews where his words were twisted, where journalists portrayed him as the drunk space cadet while Gene and Paul were the brilliant businessmen saving Kiss from his incompetence. He wasn't going to let anyone in this band create a narrative he couldn't control. Rule 6 revealed both practical concerns and deeper psychological issues. We rehearse when I say we rehearse, not on a schedule. This made some sense given Ace's history with addiction and his need for flexibility in managing his sobriety, but it also revealed his fear of commitment, his worry that locking into rigid schedules would make him feel trapped, the way he'd felt trapped in Kiss's relentless touring machine. Rule 7 was purely financial, and Mazer had actually negotiated this structure beforehand. Everyone gets paid equally from live shows, but I own the recordings. It was actually fairly generous by industry standards, but hearing Ace state it so bluntly reminded everyone that this was still, fundamentally, Ace Frehley's band. They were employees, not partners. Rules 8 and 9 dealt with the creative process in ways that seemed contradictory, but revealed Ace's complicated psychology perfectly. Rule 8. I want your ideas, but don't be offended when I change them completely. Rule 9. If something sounds like Kiss, we kill it immediately and never speak of it again. These rules captured Ace's central dilemma. He needed these musicians to bring their talents and ideas because he knew he couldn't do this alone, couldn't create a full sound without collaboration. But he was terrified of either recreating Kiss or being compared to Kiss in every single review and conversation. And then there was Rule 10. the one that made Todd Howarth seriously consider walking out, the one that revealed just how fragile Ace's mental state really was. Ace looked at all three musicians with an intensity that made the warehouse feel even colder than it already was, and said slowly and carefully, "If I fall off the wagon, if I show up drunk or high, you don't quit. You don't lecture me. You don't call Mazer behind my back. You just play through it and pretend like everything's normal until I get my shit together again." The room went absolutely silent. This wasn't a rule about creative process or business structure. This was Ace admitting his greatest fear out loud, that his addiction would destroy this second chance before it even began. And he was asking these strangers, these professional musicians who barely knew him beyond his reputation, to essentially become accomplices in covering up his potential relapses. John Regan, the bassist, the guy who'd worked with enough legendary artists to recognize when someone was drowning, set down his bass carefully and walked over to where Ace was standing in the center of that cold warehouse. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, everyone in the building thought this was it, the moment where the whole project would collapse before playing another note, where Regan would tell Ace these rules were insane and walk out, taking the other musicians with him. But Regan didn't walk toward the door. He walked right up to Ace, close enough that their conversation was private despite the echoing space, looked him directly in the eye, and said something that Anton Fig later claimed he didn't fully hear, but that completely changed the energy in the room. Whatever Regan actually said, and accounts vary wildly over the years, with some people claiming he told Ace, "We're not your babysitters, and we're not your therapists," while others insist he said something more supportive like, "We'll cover for you once, maybe twice, but after that you're on your own." It made Ace laugh. Not a polite, social chuckle. A genuine, from-the-gut laugh that seemed to release some of the desperate tension he'd been carrying since he walked into that warehouse. And then Ace did something no one expected. He took that piece of paper with his 10 rules written on it, held it up so everyone could see it clearly, and then dramatically ripped it into pieces, tearing it again and again until it was confetti, and tossed the pieces onto the concrete floor where they scattered like snow. "Forget the rules," he said, his voice suddenly lighter, almost relieved. "Let's just make sure this doesn't sound like anything I've done before. That's the only rule that matters." For the next 4 hours, they worked with an intensity that surprised everyone, including Ace himself. They took that initial 7-minute improvisation and began shaping it, refining it, turning it into something resembling an actual song with recognizable structure. Ace had a riff he'd been working on for months in his home studio, a descending chromatic line that he thought might work as a verse foundation. Todd suggested adding a pre-chorus section to build tension before the chorus. Anton played around with the drum pattern, adding syncopation and fills that gave the song forward momentum without overwhelming the groove. John's bass locked in perfectly with Anton's kick drum, creating a foundation that was simultaneously solid and flexible enough to support Ace's lead work. By early afternoon, with the winter light fading and the warehouse growing even colder, they had something that actually sounded like a real song, though it didn't have lyrics yet, and the arrangement was still loose and undefined in places. They recorded it on Mazer's basic 4-track tape machine, just to capture the ideas before anyone forgot them. When they played it back through the cheap speakers Mazer had brought, listening to that raw, unpolished recording in that freezing warehouse, something fundamental shifted in Ace's demeanor. The defensive posture that had defined him since they arrived softened noticeably. The death grip on the Jack Daniels bottle loosened. He looked at these 3 musicians he'd just met that morning, These strangers he'd tried to control with his list of rules and his desperate need for authority. And he said something that John Reagan would quote in literally every interview he gave about Frehley's Comet for the next 30 years. "I think we might actually have something here. Something that's mine. Something that's really mine." The real test came 3 months later, at a showcase gig they played at a small club called Toad's Place in New Haven, Connecticut. By then, they had a full set list of material, about 45 minutes of music, enough for a legitimate show. The audience was maybe 150 people, mostly local music fans who'd heard through the grapevine that Ace Frehley was playing with a new band. This was Ace's first public performance since leaving Kiss, his first time on stage without the Space Ace makeup, without the costume, without the character to hide behind. Just Ace Frehley in faded jeans and a leather jacket, holding his Les Paul, facing an audience that would either accept him as himself or reject him as a pale imitation of what he used to be. The first 3 songs went well, enough. The sound was tight, the band played confidently despite some nerves, and the audience seemed genuinely enthusiastic even though the venue's acoustics were terrible. But then they played Into the Night, the song from that very first rehearsal, now fully formed with lyrics Ace had written about driving away from his past, and something remarkable happened. Ace's guitar solo, the moment where he would traditionally have hidden behind technical virtuosity and familiar Kiss-style licks, went somewhere completely different. It was slower, more melodic, more emotionally vulnerable than anything he'd played in Kiss. And when he hit the final note of the solo and let it sustain while the band built back up underneath him, a woman standing in the front row, someone who'd clearly been a Kiss fan based on the vintage Dynasty tour shirt she was wearing, started crying openly. After the show, after they'd packed up their gear and were loading the van in the parking lot behind the club, that woman approached Ace. She was nervous, clearly emotional, and she told him she'd been to 17 Kiss concerts over the years, that she'd loved Space Ace more than any other member, that she'd been genuinely devastated when he left the band. And then she said something that Ace later told multiple people, including his daughter Monique, he would never forget as long as he lived. But that song tonight, Into the Night, that wasn't Space Ace playing. That was you, the real you, and it was so much better than anything you did in Kiss, because it was honest. That Valentine's Day rehearsal in 1984, with its ridiculous rules and desperate energy and eventual breakthrough into genuine musical connection, was the moment Ace Frehley stopped being defined solely as a former Kiss guitarist and started the long, difficult process of becoming himself. The rules he'd written that day weren't really about controlling the band or managing the creative process. They were about a man trying to control the narrative of his own life after years of letting Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley write his story for him. And when he tore up those rules and said, "Let's just make sure this doesn't sound like anything I've done before," he wasn't abandoning structure or discipline. He was replacing artificial, fear-based rules with the only rule that actually mattered in art. Be honest, even when honesty is absolutely terrifying. The album Frehley's Comet came out in 1987, 3 years after that first rehearsal, and while it didn't achieve Kiss-level commercial success, it accomplished something more important. It proved Ace Frehley could create meaningful music outside the shadow of Space Ace. And for the musicians who were there that freezing February morning, watching Ace struggle with his demons and his past, and his desperate need for redemption, that transformation remains the most powerful thing they ever witnessed in their careers.